In the old kingdom of Eldsworth, nestled between green rolling hills and a river that curved like a sleeping serpent, there lived a man whom everyone believed to be a fool. His name was Finian Thach, though most people in the town simply called him Old Finn, or, less kindly, Finn the Fool. He was a tall, thin man with a beard that never seemed to grow evenly, clothes that never seemed to fit properly, and a donkey that was, by all accounts, just as stubborn and strange as its owner. Finian lived alone in a small, crooked cottage at the edge of the town square, right where the cobblestone road turned to dirt and the market stalls gave way to open fields. He had no wife, no children, and no fortune. What he did have, however, was a mind sharper than any blade the blacksmith had ever forged, though he took great care to keep that particular weapon well hidden beneath layers of laughter, nonsense, and seemingly absurd behavior. Every morning, Finian would ride his donkey backward through the market, facing the animal's tail instead of its head. When people stopped to laugh and ask him why he rode in such a ridiculous manner, he would smile his wide gap-toothed smile and say, "If I face forward, I cannot see where I have been, and a man who forgets where he has been will never truly understand where he is going." The people would shake their heads, chuckle among themselves, and walk away convinced that poor Finian had lost whatever small portion of sense God had once granted him. But there were a few, very few, who heard those words and felt something stir in their chests, something that whispered that perhaps the fool was not so foolish after all. The town of Eldsworth was ruled, at least in name, by King Harold III, a man who sat on his throne in the great stone castle on the hill and believed himself to be wise because he was surrounded by men who told him so. King Harold was not cruel by nature, but he was lazy in spirit and slow in judgment, the kind of ruler who preferred comfort over justice and silence over truth. He trusted those who flattered him and ignored those who challenged him, which meant that the true power in Eldsworth did not rest in the castle at all. It rested in the marketplace, in the thick, jeweled fingers of a man named Edmund Blackwood. Edmund Blackwood was the wealthiest merchant in the kingdom. He owned 3 grain warehouses, 2 textile mills, a fleet of trading carts, and the loyalty of nearly every merchant and shopkeeper within 50 miles. He was a large man, broad in the shoulders and round in the belly, with a face that could shift from a warm, generous smile to a cold, calculating stare in the time it took to blink. He dressed in fine velvet coats and wore rings on every finger, and when he walked through the market, people stepped aside not out of respect, but out of fear. For Edmund Blackwood had built his empire not through honest labor or fair trade, but through manipulation, deception, and a ruthless willingness to crush anyone who stood in his way.
For years, Blackwood had been quietly tightening his grip on the town's grain supply. He would buy grain from the farmers at harvest time, when prices were low, store it in his massive warehouses, and then wait. He would wait through the autumn, through the early winter, until the people's own supplies began to run thin and hunger started to knock on their doors. Then, and only then, would he open his warehouses and sell the grain back to the very people who had grown it, but at prices 3, 4, sometimes 5 times what he had originally paid. The farmers could do nothing. The townspeople could do nothing. They needed the grain to survive the winter, and Blackwood was the only one who had it. Those who dared to complain were silenced quickly. Blackwood had allies in the king's court, men whose pockets he had lined with gold and whose secrets he kept locked away like weapons to be used when needed. He had the ear of Lord Whitmore, the king's chief advisor, a man whose fondness for wine and gambling had left him deeply indebted to Blackwood's generosity. Through Whitmore, Blackwood ensured that any petition against him was dismissed before it ever reached the king's attention. The system was perfect, airtight, and merciless. The rich grew richer, the poor grew poorer, and the king sat on his throne, blissfully unaware, eating roasted pheasant and listening to poetry. Finian saw all of this.
He saw it clearly, the way a man standing on a hilltop can see the shape of a maze that confuses everyone trapped inside it. He saw the widow, Margaret Harlow, weeping at the market because she could not afford flour to bake bread for her 3 children. He saw old Thomas the farmer selling his last cow because Blackwood's prices had drained every coin from his savings. He saw the faces of the people growing thinner while Blackwood's belly grew rounder. And something deep inside Finian, something he usually kept buried beneath his jokes and his foolishness, began to burn. But Finian was no ordinary man, and he understood something that most people did not. He understood that power could not be fought with power, not when you had none. He understood that a fool could go where a wise man could not, say what a brave man dared not, and see what a proud man refused to see. The fool was invisible. The fool was harmless. The fool was free. And so, on a cold Tuesday morning in late autumn, when the first frost had painted the rooftops silver and the smell of Blackwood's stored grain hung in the air like a taunt, Finian climbed onto his donkey, faced the tail as always, and rode into the market square with a plan forming quietly behind his smiling eyes. The market square was already bustling when Finian arrived that Tuesday morning, though bustling was perhaps too generous a word. The people moved through the stalls with the heavy, reluctant steps of those who knew they would leave with less than they needed. The vegetable sellers had little to offer, the bread makers had raised their prices again, and the butcher's table held more bones than meat. Winter was approaching, and everyone could feel its cold breath on the backs of their necks. Everyone except Edmund Blackwood, who stood in front of his grand warehouse at the far end of the square, arms folded across his velvet chest, watching the crowd the way a cat watches mice deciding which hole to run into. Finian dismounted his donkey, or rather, he fell off it, tumbling sideways into a pile of cabbages that old Martha Finch had been trying to sell since dawn. The crowd erupted in laughter. Martha cursed at him. Finian stood up, brushed a cabbage leaf from his beard, bowed deeply to Martha as though she were the queen herself, and said in a loud, cheerful voice, "Madam, your cabbages have broken my fall and my dignity in equal measure. I am forever in your debt." More laughter. Martha tried to stay angry but could not help the small smile that crept onto her weathered face. Finian dusted himself off and walked casually toward Blackwood's warehouse, his donkey trailing behind him with the slow, indifferent pace of an animal that had long since stopped caring about the opinions of humans. When he reached the front of the warehouse, he stopped, tilted his head, and stared at the large wooden doors as though he were admiring a painting in a gallery. Blackwood's 2 guards, thick-armed men named Garvey and Holt, watched him with suspicion. "Move along, Finn," Garvey said, his hand resting on the club at his belt. "Nothing here for the likes of you." Finian did not move. Instead, he leaned close to the warehouse door and pressed his ear against the wood. He closed his eyes. He nodded slowly, as though listening to something only he could hear. Then he pulled back, his eyes wide with theatrical amazement. "Gentlemen," he whispered loudly, loud enough for the nearby merchants to hear, "the grain inside this warehouse is singing." Garvey and Holt exchanged a look. "Singing," Holt repeated flatly. "Yes, singing," Finian said, pressing his ear to the door again. "It is a sad song, actually, a lament. The grain is weeping because it wishes to be eaten, but it has been locked away in the dark for so long that it fears it has been forgotten." He paused, then added thoughtfully, "Grain has feelings, you know. My grandmother told me so, and she was never wrong about anything except the weather and her second husband." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the sound of Finian's voice and the promise of entertainment. People elbowed each other, grinning. The fool was performing again. But Finian was not performing. He was planting a seed. "I wonder," he said, turning to face the growing crowd with an expression of exaggerated puzzlement, "how much grain is inside this warehouse? It sounds like quite a lot, judging by the volume of the singing. A choir, I would say.
perhaps enough grain to feed the entire town for the whole winter. He scratched his uneven beard. And yet I hear that Widow Harlow cannot buy flour for her children. Strange, is it not? All this grain singing away in the dark, and little Clara Harlow goes to bed with an empty stomach. The laughter in the crowd faded. A few people looked at each other. Someone murmured something. Finian had touched the nerve he had been aiming for, but he did not press it. A wise fool knows when to push and when to retreat. He suddenly broke into a wide grin, slapped the warehouse door, and declared, "But what do I know? I am only a fool who rides his donkey backward. Perhaps the grain is not singing at all. Perhaps it is only the rats."
He turned and walked away, whistling a tune that seemed both cheerful and melancholy at the same time. Behind him, the crowd lingered near the warehouse doors, staring at the thick wood and iron bolts, thinking thoughts that had not occurred to them before. How much grain was inside? How long had it been there? And why, in a town where children went hungry, was it locked away behind guarded doors? Word of Finian's little performance reached Edmund Blackwood within the hour. Blackwood was sitting in his private office above the textile mill, reviewing ledgers with his accountant, a nervous bird-like man named Percival Crane, when one of his informants, a boy who swept floors in the tavern and reported gossip in exchange for copper coins, came running in with the story. Blackwood listened without expression. When the boy finished, Blackwood reached into his coat, produced a coin, and flipped it to the boy, who caught it, bowed, and disappeared. Then Blackwood turned to Percival and said, "The fool was at my warehouse." Percival looked up from his ledgers, his quill trembling slightly. "Finian Thatch? He is harmless, sir. Everyone knows he is mad." "Madmen do not concern me," said Blackwood slowly, leaning back in his chair and pressing his fingertips together. "But men who pretend to be mad concern me greatly." Percival swallowed. "You think he is pretending?" Blackwood did not answer immediately. He stared at the wall, his dark eyes narrowing. Then he shook his head and laughed, a short dismissive laugh that sounded like a door closing. "No, he is a fool. Fools talk, and talk means nothing. Ignore him." This was Edmund Blackwood's first mistake. He underestimated the fool because the fool looked foolish. He dismissed the words because they came wrapped in laughter, and he assumed that because the people had laughed, they had not listened. But they had listened. They had heard the part about the singing grain and the hungry children, and though they laughed on the outside, the words burrowed into their minds like worms into soft wood, quiet and invisible, but working, always working. That evening, Finian sat in his crooked cottage, feeding his donkey a bruised apple and staring into the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and in those shadows, Finian saw the outline of his plan, still rough, still forming, but growing clearer with each passing hour. He needed the people to start asking questions, not to him, but to each other. He needed the whisper to become a murmur, and the murmur to become a conversation, and the conversation to become a demand. But most importantly, he needed Blackwood to remain exactly as he was, confident, dismissive, and blind to the danger gathering at his feet like rising water. Finian bit into his own apple and smiled. "Tomorrow," he said to the donkey, "we visit the king." The donkey chewed its apple and said nothing, which Finian took as agreement. The castle of King Harold III sat on the highest hill in Eldsworth like a crown on a balding head, impressive from a distance but showing its cracks up close. The stone walls were thick but poorly maintained, the banners were faded, and the guards at the gate looked more bored than vigilant. Finian rode his donkey up the winding path to the castle entrance, still facing backward, still smiling, still looking to any observer like a man who had lost a wrestling match with reality and had not bothered to get back up. The guards at the gate knew Finian. Everyone in Eldsworth knew Finian. One of them, a young soldier named Barrett, stepped forward with his hand raised and said,
Finn, you cannot bring that donkey into the castle. Finian looked offended. This is not a donkey, young man. This is my advisor. He has more sense than half the men inside those walls, and he works for apples instead of gold, which makes him considerably cheaper than Lord Whitmore. Barrett tried not to laugh. His older companion, a stern-faced man named Collis, did not try at all. Turn around and go home, Finn, Collis said. The king does not receive fools. Then how does he receive Lord Whitmore every morning? Finian asked innocently. Barrett let out a snort of laughter that he quickly disguised as a cough. Even Collis pressed his lips together to suppress a smile. The truth was that Lord Whitmore was not popular among the soldiers, who had watched their wages shrink while the advisor's wardrobe expanded. Finian knew this. He knew the small resentments that lived in the hearts of ordinary men, the quiet angers that people swallowed every day because they believed they had no choice. These were the threads he intended to pull. I have a gift for the king, Finian announced, reaching into the saddlebag on his donkey and producing a small clay pot sealed with a cloth tied around its mouth. It is a rare and magical substance. I must deliver it personally. Collis eyed the pot suspiciously. What is it? Air, Finian said solemnly. It is the air from the marketplace where the common people breathe. I wish the king to smell it so that he may know what his kingdom smells like outside these walls. It smells of hunger, in case you were wondering, and also slightly of Martha Finch's cabbages. The guards did not know what to do with this. The fool was clearly mad, but there was something in his voice, a steadiness beneath the absurdity, that made them hesitate. In the end, it was Barrett who made the decision. He was young, he was curious, and somewhere deep inside him he wanted to see what would happen when the fool met the king. He stepped aside and opened the gate. Go on, Finn, but leave the donkey outside. Finian dismounted, patted the donkey on the nose, and whispered, Wait here. If I am not back in an hour, eat their roses. Then he walked through the gate and into the castle courtyard, carrying his clay pot of marketplace air like a priest carrying a holy relic. The throne room was large, cold, and decorated with tapestries that depicted battles King Harold had never fought and victories he had never earned. The king himself sat on an elevated wooden throne padded with red cushions, looking comfortable in the way that only a man who has never been truly uncomfortable can look. He was round-faced and soft-handed, with a crown that sat slightly crooked on his thinning hair. To his right stood Lord Whitmore, tall and angular, dressed in a coat that cost more than most families earned in a year. His eyes were sharp and watchful, the eyes of a man who survived not by strength but by calculation.
Several courtiers and minor nobles were present, seated on benches along the walls, engaged in the primary occupation of courtiers everywhere, which is to look important while doing absolutely nothing.
When Finian walked in, still carrying his clay pot, every head turned and every eyebrow rose. Who let this man in? Lord Whitmore demanded, his voice cutting through the room like a cold wind. The door was open, Finian said cheerfully. I assumed it was an invitation. Doors are like mouths, my lord. When they are open, they are either speaking or waiting to be fed. King Harold leaned forward on his throne, squinting. I know you. You are the fool who rides his donkey backwards. Your Majesty remembers me, Finian said, bowing so deeply that his beard nearly touched the floor. I am honored. I am Finian Thach, your most humble and least expensive subject. I have brought you a gift. He held up the clay pot. What is that? The king asked, more amused than annoyed. It is a jar of truth, your majesty, Finian said. I collected it this morning in the marketplace. It is very rare. In fact, I believe it may be the last jar of truth left in the entire kingdom, as the supply has been declining sharply in recent years, particularly within these walls. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the courtiers. Lord Whitmore's expression hardened. He recognized danger the way a dog recognizes the scent of a wolf. Instinctively, before the mind fully understands what the nose is telling it. This is nonsense, Whitmore said sharply. Your Majesty, this man is a known fool. He wastes your time. On the contrary, Finian said, turning to face Whitmore with a smile that was warm on the surface and razor-sharp underneath. I am saving his time, because time wasted on lies is far more costly than time spent on foolishness. A fool may waste a minute of your day, my lord. A liar can waste your entire reign. The room went silent. King Harold stared at Finian. The courtiers stared at Finian. Lord Whitmore stared at Finian with an expression that hovered between fury and something that looked remarkably like fear. Finian opened the clay pot. It was, of course, empty. He held it up to the king and said, Do you see, your majesty? This is what truth looks like in Eldsworth. Empty, gone, used up. And do you know who took it? He paused, letting the silence stretch like a rope pulled tight. I do not know either, but I hear the grain in Master Blackwood's warehouse singing at night, and I wonder why it sings while children cry. He placed the pot gently on the floor in front of the throne, bowed again, and walked out of the room without another word, leaving behind a silence so thick that even the fire in the great hearth seemed afraid to crackle.
Edmund Blackwood did not sleep well that night. Word of Finian's performance in the throne room had spread through Eldsworth like fire through dry wheat, carried by servants who had overheard, guards who had whispered, and courtiers who could not resist repeating a good story even when repeating it was dangerous. By the following morning, every tavern, every bakery, every wash-house in town was buzzing with the tale of the fool who had brought an empty pot of truth to the king and asked why grain sang while children cried. Blackwood sat in his office, his thick fingers wrapped around a goblet of wine, and for the first time in many years, he felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. He felt uncertain. Not afraid, not yet, but uncertain, which for a man like Blackwood was almost worse. Fear he could fight, uncertainty he could not control, and control was the foundation upon which his entire empire was built. He had controlled the grain, he had controlled the prices, he had controlled Lord Whitmore and, through him, the king's ear. But he could not control a fool who spoke nonsense that somehow sounded like truth. He summoned Percival Crane to his office and gave him instructions. I want the fool discredited, he said calmly. Not harmed, not yet. Harming a fool makes a martyr. Discrediting a fool makes him invisible. Find something, a debt, a theft, a lie. If you cannot find something, create something. I want this done before the week is finished. Percival nodded rapidly, his thin neck bobbing like a bird drinking water, and hurried out to do his master's bidding. Within 2 days, he had constructed a plan that was, by Percival's modest standards, rather clever. He hired a boy from the neighboring village, a boy no one in Eldsworth would recognize, and gave him a small sack containing 3 silver candlesticks stolen from Blackwood's own collection. The boy was instructed to hide the candlesticks inside Finian's cottage and then disappear. That same evening, Percival would send an anonymous report to the town constable claiming that Finian had been seen stealing from Blackwood's estate. The constable would search the cottage, find the candlesticks, and Finian would be arrested as a common thief. A thief's words carry no weight. The singing grain would be forgotten. The empty pot of truth would become nothing more than another joke told by a criminal fool. The plan went smoothly at first. The boy slipped into Finian's cottage while Finian was in the market square performing his daily routine of falling off his donkey and making people laugh. The candlesticks were hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the fireplace. The boy left without being seen. Everything was perfect, except for one detail that Percival had not anticipated. Finian's donkey, who had been tied to a post outside the cottage, had watched the entire thing with the calm, unblinking attention that only a donkey can maintain. And when Finian returned home that afternoon, the donkey was standing directly over the loose floorboard,
stomping its hoof against the wood in a rhythm that Finian, who had lived with the animal for 12 years, immediately recognized as agitation. Finian knelt down, pried up the board, and found the candlesticks. He held them up to the light, turning them slowly, examining the Blackwood family crest engraved into the base of each one. He sat back on his heels and smiled, not the wide, foolish smile he wore for the public, but the quiet, thin smile of a man who has just watched his opponent make exactly the move he was hoping for. "Thank you, my friend," he said to the donkey. "You have better eyes than most men and considerably better judgment."
Finian did not remove the candlesticks. He did not hide them elsewhere or throw them into the river. Instead, he placed them back under the floorboard, put the board back in its place, and waited. He waited because he understood that the trap itself was more valuable than freedom from the trap. If he simply disposed of the evidence, Blackwood would try again with something different, something harder to detect. But if he let the trap spring and then turned it inside out in front of witnesses, the trap would become a confession, not of Finian's guilt, but of Blackwood's desperation. The constable arrived the next morning, a stout, red-faced man named Oswald Briggs, who had held his position for 20 years and had long ago learned that justice in Eldsworth meant doing whatever kept the powerful happy and the powerless quiet. He brought 2 deputies and a warrant signed by Lord Whitmore himself. When they knocked on Finian's door, Finian opened it immediately, as though he had been expecting company. "Constable Briggs," he said warmly, "what a pleasure. Have you come for breakfast? I have nothing but stale bread and cold water, but I assure you the conversation will be excellent." Briggs pushed past him without ceremony. "We have received a report that you are in possession of stolen property, Finn. Step aside." "Stolen property?" Finian gasped, placing his hand over his heart with theatrical shock. "In my cottage? Constable, the most valuable thing I own is a donkey with questionable manners and a blanket with more holes than fabric. But please, search to your satisfaction. I have nothing to hide." Briggs and his deputies searched the cottage. It took them less than 5 minutes to find the loose floorboard and the 3 silver candlesticks beneath it. Briggs held them up, and the small crowd that had gathered outside Finian's door gasped. The Blackwood crest was clearly visible. "Finian Thatch," he announced, his voice carrying the rehearsed weight of official authority. "You are under arrest for the theft of property belonging to Master Edmund Blackwood. You will be brought before the King's Court to answer for your crime." Finian nodded slowly, his expression not one of fear or panic, but of deep, almost serene satisfaction. "Before the King's Court, you say," he repeated, as though savoring each word. "In front of the King himself, and the nobles, and the people who will surely come to watch." Briggs frowned, sensing something wrong but unable to identify exactly what it was. "Yes," he said cautiously. Finian smiled, the wide smile this time, the one that made him look foolish and harmless and completely, utterly mad. "Wonderful," he said softly. "That is exactly where I need to be."
The trial of Finian Thatch was the most anticipated event in Eldsworth since the coronation of King Harold himself, and considerably more exciting since the coronation had involved mostly long speeches and dry cake. By dawn on the appointed day, the great hall of the castle was already filling with spectators. Farmers left their fields, shopkeepers closed their doors, mothers brought their children. Even Martha Finch came, carrying a basket of unsold cabbages, claiming she wanted a front row seat in case the fool said something worth remembering. The hall was arranged in the traditional manner for a royal trial. King Harold sat on his throne at the far end, flanked by Lord Whitmore on his right and the royal scribe on his left.
Constable Briggs stood near the center with the 3 silver candlesticks displayed on a velvet cloth as evidence. Edmund Blackwood sat in the front row of the gallery, dressed in his finest coat, his rings freshly polished, his expression one of restrained triumph. He had orchestrated everything. The fool would be convicted, the fool would be silenced, and the singing grain would never be mentioned again. Finian was brought in by 2 guards, his hands unbound because even Briggs had felt slightly ridiculous shackling a man whose greatest known weapon was a talent for falling off donkeys. Finian walked to the center of the hall, looked around at the packed gallery, and nodded approvingly as though he had personally organized the event and was pleased with the attendance. Finian Thatch, King Harold began, reading from a scroll that Whitmore had prepared for him. You stand accused of stealing 3 silver candlesticks from the estate of Master Edmund Blackwood. How do you answer? Finian tilted his head thoughtfully. Before I answer, Your Majesty, may I ask a question? The king glanced at Whitmore, who shook his head slightly. The king, however, was curious. The empty pot of truth had stayed in his mind longer than he would have admitted to anyone. You may ask, he said. Thank you, Your Majesty. My question is this. If a man places his own property inside another man's house without that man's knowledge or permission, has the second man stolen it or has the first man delivered it? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's expression flickered just barely, like a candle touched by a draft. Explain yourself, the king said, leaning forward. Finian turned to face the gallery, addressing not just the king but the entire room. Your Majesty, these candlesticks were not stolen by me. They were placed inside my cottage while I was away, hidden beneath a floorboard I have never loosened in 12 years of living there. My donkey, who was tied outside my door, saw the boy who entered my home and hid the objects. I did not recognize the boy. He was not from Eldsworth. He was sent by someone who wanted these candlesticks to be found in my home so that I would be called a thief and my words would be dismissed as the ramblings of a criminal. The murmur grew louder. People turned to each other. Blackwood sat perfectly still, his face carved from stone, betraying nothing. Lord Whitmore stepped forward quickly. This is absurd, he said, his sharp voice cutting through the noise. The accused is inventing a story to escape justice. He offers no proof, only the supposed testimony of a donkey. Laughter scattered through the crowd, but it was thin, uncertain laughter. Finian waited for it to fade before he spoke again. My lord is correct that a donkey cannot testify, Finian said calmly, but a boy can, and I believe that if the constable were to search the village of Dunmore 3 miles east of here, he would find a boy of about 14 recently paid a sum of money he cannot explain, who would be very willing to describe who hired him and what he was asked to do, especially if the alternative is being charged as an accomplice to a crime against the king's justice. The hall went silent. Finian had spoken these words not with the voice of a fool, but with the voice of a man who had spent careful, patient days gathering information, following threads, asking quiet questions in places where a fool could go unnoticed because no one guards their tongue around a man they believe to be harmless. Blackwood rose to his feet. Your Majesty, I will not sit here and listen to a madman accuse me through implication and fantasy. I demand that this trial proceed according to the law. The law, Finian repeated, turning to face Blackwood directly for the first time. The law, yes. Let us talk about the law, Master Blackwood. The law says that hoarding essential grain during a time of shortage to artificially raise prices is a crime against the crown. Statute 14 of the Charter of Fair Commerce, written by King Harold I, may God rest his wiser soul. The law says that any merchant found guilty of deliberate hoarding shall forfeit his stores to the crown for distribution to the people. The law says these things, Your Majesty. I know because I spent 3 weeks in the castle library reading every charter and statute your grandfather ever signed. The scribes thought I was sleeping. I was not. He reached into his coat and produced a rolled piece of parchment, old and yellowed but perfectly legible. He handed it to the royal scribe, who unrolled it, read it, and then looked up at the king with wide eyes and a slow, confirming nod. "It is genuine, Your Majesty. Statute 14 of the Charter of Fair Commerce. It is still binding law."
The hall erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Blackwood. Widow Margaret Harlow was weeping openly, clutching her youngest child to her chest. Old Thomas the farmer was standing on his bench, his fist raised, his weathered face streaming with tears he did not bother to wipe. Blackwood's face had gone white, his carefully constructed mask crumbling like plaster in rain. He turned to Lord Whitmore for support, but Whitmore had already taken 2 steps backward, distancing himself from the sinking ship with the practiced instinct of a career survivor. King Harold raised his hand for silence. It took a long time for silence to come, but when it did, it was absolute. "Master Blackwood," the king said, and his voice carried a weight that surprised everyone, including himself. "Is it true that you have been hoarding grain while the people of this kingdom go hungry?" Blackwood opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time in his life, the merchant who had always had the right words, the perfect argument, the polished excuse, found himself standing in a room full of people who were no longer willing to believe him. The air itself had changed. The invisible architecture of fear and reverence that had protected him for years had collapsed in the space of 10 minutes, dismantled not by a sword or an army, but a fool with a donkey and an old piece of parchment. "I am a businessman," Master Blackwood said, his voice strained. "I have broken no law." Finian stepped aside and gestured toward the royal scribe, who held up the charter for all to see. "The law disagrees, Master Blackwood, and unlike your warehouse doors, the law cannot be locked." King Harold stood from his throne, and the simple act of standing seemed to awaken something in him, a dormant sense of duty that had been sleeping beneath years of comfort and flattery. He ordered the immediate inspection of Blackwood's warehouses. He ordered Constable Briggs to locate the boy from Dunmore and take his testimony. He ordered Lord Whitmore to remain in the castle under guard until his financial connections to Blackwood could be thoroughly investigated. And he ordered that if the warehouses were found to contain hoarded grain, every last bushel would be distributed to the people of Eldsworth before the first snow. Blackwood was escorted from the hall by soldiers, his rings catching the light one final time as he passed through the doors. He did not look back. Lord Whitmore followed shortly after, his angular face gray with the understanding that his career, his freedom, and possibly his neck were now in serious jeopardy. Finian stood alone in the center of the great hall, surrounded by cheering, weeping, laughing people who reached out to touch his shoulders, shake his hand, and call him wise. He accepted their gratitude with the same gentle, lopsided smile he always wore, then raised his hands for quiet. "I am not wise," he said simply. "I am a fool who pays attention, and I ride my donkey backward because the past is where the truth hides when the present is too afraid to hold it." He paused and looked directly at King Harold. "Your Majesty, a kingdom does not need a fool to speak truth. It needs a king who is willing to hear it even when it arrives in an empty pot." King Harold met his gaze, and for the first time in his reign, nodded not with the lazy agreement of a comfortable man, but with the genuine understanding of a ruler who had been given a second chance to deserve his crown. Finian bowed, walked out of the castle, climbed onto his donkey facing the tail, and rode home through streets lined with people who would never again call him a fool, without wondering whether the word meant something entirely different than they had always believed. The grain was distributed 3 days later. The winter was hard, but no one in Eldsworth went hungry. And on quiet evenings,
When the fire was low and the wind pressed against the shutters, people would tell their children the story of Finian Toch, the man who wore foolishness like armor and carried truth like a hidden blade, and who proved that the most dangerous man in any kingdom is not the one with the most power, but the one with the most patience.